So we have this partnership, right? Decades in the making. And now it looks like it might be about to shatter. Today, we're going to dig into the deep divide between the European Union and Israel and ask one really critical question. Are sanctions actually inevitable?
So the big question is, could the EU really do it? Could they actually hit one of their closest partners with economic penalties? Well, it's not that simple. And the answer really shows you just how torn the union is between its own complex history and just overwhelming public pressure.
And really, that public pressure, that's where this whole story kicks off. What we're seeing is this massive disconnect between what people on the streets of Europe are feeling and what their leaders are actually doing.
Okay, so for the better part of 2 years, public anger across Europe over the devastating conflict in Gaza has just been building and building. Polls like this one from YouGov show historic collapse in support for Israel, and it's created this political firestorm that EU leaders just can't ignore anymore. And look, this criticism isn't just coming from protesters on the street. What's really fascinating here is the pressure coming from inside the House. This incredibly sharp critique comes from Joseph Borrell, who was the EU's top diplomat. He basically wrote that by doing nothing, EU leaders were becoming complicit. That's a powerful accusation coming from someone right at the heart of the European establishment. So if the EU is going to make a move, what's the biggest tool in its toolbox? It's not military, that's for sure. It's all about money. It all comes down to the very foundation of their relationship. All right, this right here is the document that matters, the EU-Israel Association Agreement. It was signed way back in 2000, and it's the bedrock of their whole partnership. But you gotta look closely at Article 2. It says the entire agreement is based on respect for human rights. And that one little clause, that's the legal hook they're using to even talk about sanctions. And this agreement isn't just some symbolic piece of paper. It comes with huge practical benefits for Israel. We're talking tariff-free access to this massive market, visa-free travel for its citizens, and a seat at the political table. Suspending any of this stuff? That would hurt, and it would hurt immediately.
Right, so how did we get here? How did the EU go from a hard no on sanctions to actually, putting a proposal on the table? Well, it wasn't a flip of a switch. It was a slow burn, a very deliberate process.
Yeah, this shift from no to maybe didn't happen overnight. You can really see the momentum building on this timeline. Back in late 2024, a push to just suspend talks gets blocked, flat out. But fast forward to May 2025, and suddenly a formal review passes. Then there's this little pause in July based on some promises that apparently weren't kept. And then, finally, in September, you get the big one, a formal proposal from the very top to suspend trade benefits. And that proposal? It goes right for the jugular trade. Let's crunch the numbers to see just how much is on the line. I mean, just look at this chart. It couldn't be clearer. The European Union isn't just one of Israel's trading partners. It is the #1 partner. We're talking about almost a third of its total trade in goods. Nobody else even comes close.
And this is the key right here. The whole relationship is completely lopsided. For the EU, Israel is their 31st biggest partner? But for Israel, the EU is everything. It's #1. That imbalance, that's where all of Europe's leverage comes from. So what does using that leverage actually look like? Well, the proposal would slap tariffs back onto Israeli exports worth 5.8 billion euros a year. These are goods that make up over a third of what they sell to the EU. Suddenly, they get way more expensive, way less competitive. It's a direct shot at the Israeli economy. Okay, but a proposal is just that, a proposal. To actually make it happen, you have to get through the final boss of EU politics, this incredibly complex voting system. So, for something like this, a trade measure, you need what's called a qualified majority. And trust me, it's not as simple as just counting votes. You have to clear 2 hurdles at the same time. First, you need enough countries on board. At least 15 out of the 27 have to say yes. But then, and this is the really tricky part, those countries that say yes have to add up to at least 65% of the total EU population. Now, getting those 15 countries, that actually seems doable. Remember, 17 countries voted for that initial review. But this chart right here shows you the real problem, that 65% population rule. And it really all comes down to 2 specific countries. Just look at this. Germany and Italy, by themselves, make up 30% of the EU's population. And since they have historically been against sanctions on Israel, their combined weight is enough to create what's called a blocking minority.
Basically, it makes it mathematically almost impossible to hit that 65% mark, no matter how many smaller countries vote yes.
So, at the end of the day, the whole thing is hanging by a thread. It's cut between all this public anger, this real economic leverage, and these super complicated political games. And what's at stake here is just massive. And it's way more than just money and tariffs. You're looking at a potential shock to Israel's economy, for sure. But it's also this huge symbolic statement from the West. And maybe most importantly, it's a major test of whether the EU can actually use its economic muscle to get what it wants in foreign policy.
And all of this brings us to one last really challenging question that comes out of the source material. As Europe is thinking about using its biggest weapon, economic pressure, you have to wonder, why haven't we seen a similar unified diplomatic and economic push from Arab nations to back it up? It's a question that really widens the lens and, well, leaves us with a lot to think about.